much. I really think about kind of urban communities, what's going on in the neighborhoods, in the communities, what kind of like empowers communities to be able to like respond to shared problems like violence. That's like something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. In addition to my research, I'm also the data consultant at BARI. So what that means is that like anytime someone like any of you or just like anyone in the city of Boston, maybe someone has like a research question they don't know how to answer, or maybe there's like a topic they're interested in, but they don't know like how to start kind of like researching it. My role is kind of to consult people through that, kind of like helping people think through like anywhere along the research process. It could be thinking of like, what kind of data do I need? Or it could be something like, what kind of technical skills, like what program do I need to execute this task, right? Like it's just kind of my job to kind of like help any way I can, during the research process, just to kind of help people answer the research questions that are important to them, right? Like I think a lot of the value in bringing people together here is kind of like figuring out like what you all need to learn, and like we can kind of learn like how to get you there. I think that's like a really like important kind of like goal of how we kind of do all this. And so kind of to get started, and so Mary, I think you came on after we did introductions. Did you want to take a moment to just kind of like introduce yourself to the group? If you just want to hang out, that's totally welcome as well. Okay, so yeah, I want to start off with like a little icebreaker here, and Gigi, I'll warn you that you've been through this before, so it'll actually be interesting to see if kind of like your responses change at all from kind of like where we started last week. But I just wanted to kind of like go around the room and think about, for you, what is the value of data? Like how can data help you do your job? Like why do you think the data is important enough, right? Because if you didn't see some value in data, you might not even like be in this room right now, right? So I kind of want to think about like why is data valuable to us? Cool. Hi, Mary. Great to have you from Toronto. Just responding to the chat there.
Yeah. Do you want?
Yeah, I mean,
want examples of why data is useful, or?
yeah, I mean, like, why is it useful to you? Kind of trying to think of like, what is, why do you care about data?
Well, I care about it mainly because it may not often indicate a cause for something, like point A leads to point B, but it could be something that would show a relationship. At the library, we're very interested in collecting data so that we can maximize the use of our investment in research tools like databases. People use databases. We want to know how many times, how often it's being accessed. If there's a limit, because not all of our databases have unlimited access. There are times when we have, we reach the limit and then we have turnaways. That data, the data of turnaways, is important also because that may mean we need to invest in more licenses. So like there's some ebooks where only one person at a time can use them, but we have other ebooks where there's unlimited access. So not just the books, but same as the databases, So I think it's important for me to maximize the use of the resources that I'm not speaking for the library, but as a librarian, I am interested in maximizing the use of the resources that we invest in.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a really cool answer, right? Because you kind of started by saying like data can show us relationships, right? Like maybe not causes, but relationships. But what those relationships do is they help us make decisions, right? Like I think that's kind of like at the crux of your answer there, right? Is that like by learning about the world, we can actually like make decisions that are kind of like rooted in like some value, right? Like we're not going blind, right? At this training last week, someone kind of made the comment that like data can be a flashlight that kind of like shows you different kind of like features, whatever you're trying to study. And I thought that was like a really kind of like powerful metaphor there, right? You can kind of like shine the light on a problem that you're trying to learn about. I saw Mary in the chat, so I can relay that for the group. Uh, so Mary said that they have a very strong gun culture and problem among youth in the community in Toronto, and problems between the community and the police in the city. And so, as a young person who's interested in data, she's interested in learning and problem solving, right? So I think it's kind of like on a similar theme there, right? Like data can help us like learn about something and then actually like take action based on what we've learned. And just building on the chat here, she says there's public initiatives there that work and that don't work. She's been asked to represent youth in the city and also to, sorry, I lost my reading there. She says, I've been asked to represent youth in the city and also to public housing, but I am a young Black person and don't know if I want to be more involved on the task forces. That's me. Great. That's like, it's really exciting to have you both, someone like from another, not even another part of the country, but another part of the world, right? Another country, but also someone who's kind of like in this position with potentially a lot of responsibility and like thinking through how data can kind of help you with that. I think that's a really awesome response. Gigi, what is the value of data for you? And I know we spent like a lot of time, you and I, talking about this kind of like a week ago. So where do we stand now? What do you think is the value of data?
I think it's similar to actually what Mary has said, because I'm working in a school and we tend to have high absenteeism. And so some of it, when you're looking at the data, it's like, well, for the most part, if you're looking at kindergarten and having high absenteeism, it's not based on them. They're not walking themselves to school. So it's good to look at the data to find out why, like, is it the parents aren't coming or the older sibling isn't showing up, or is like, are they having transportation issues? Like just looking at the data to figure out how we can assist them better also to help come to a resolution and how to resolve that issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when you're dealing with like youth, it's important to think of all the causes, right? Because like, if you're just assuming that like the youth is the cause of that, right? You're like putting kind of like a policy intervention on like an individual who like doesn't have much agency, right? We're talking about kids. But I think there's also like an interesting parallel there with like the criminal justice system, right? I'm thinking of like, why does someone commit crime, right? I mean, like we could talk all day about like how much like personal responsibility does like one person have, right? But like I think at least by the end of the training, we can probably agree that like regardless of someone's personal factors, right? There's like factors outside of one person that kind of like is like pushing them in one direction with their behavior, right? So I think that like what you said there, Gigi, really does kind of like connect well to what we're kind of like going to be going through today. Did anyone else have, so I guess there's only three of us, there's not too much anyone else's, but just kind of like following up on this, did anyone have any other thoughts that kind of like came up hearing each other about thinking like why data is so great, like why we should be trying to use it more or learn from it? If not, that's okay. You all had like very good answers. So I think we've all come like ready to rock and roll today. And so I kind of want to flip the question on the head a little bit, right? We can all kind of like agree that there's a lot of value in data, but I think a lot of us have probably experienced challenges in using data before, right? Like data work, I think rarely goes smoothly for anyone from like start to finish. Like I'm going to answer this research question. It's like rare that you're just like looking up data and you've got your question answered immediately, right? Like there's challenges and roadblocks and stuff. So I wanted to kind of like probe you all a bit and think about like, what are some real challenges that come up when trying to use data, like just like in our work, kind of like in our personal interests? What makes it hard to use data, or what makes it hard to use data to kind of like find out what we need to know?
I think one thing that makes it hard to use data is the validity of the source. Because if someone just respond, like if it's a questionnaire, if it's a questionnaire or something like that, is a person just responding just to respond and they don't really care about the answer? Mm-hmm. Or, is it people really taking an interest in what the responses are? So there's all kind of like issues around validity.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, like in your kind of like thinking about like the kids and stuff, have you come across any data that like you're like, this data like seems like it has problems?
Not so much. I've just started looking into the data, but I know, just thinking of like surveys we had at the end of the year regarding, I think it was a climate survey or something like that, but we had a very small response. So I think it was like less than 8%.
Oh,
And I'm thinking of the parent survey in that one, it's less than 8%. So that's not, is that even accurate? I mean, that's not giving me a good look at the data at all.
Right. Yeah. And like you kind of question, like, are those parents, like those 8% of parents who fill that out, are they like different than all of like the parents who didn't, right? Like, are you getting like a subsample of like the certain types of parents who are like really engaged, right? Whereas like if you're thinking of like youth intervention, like you probably want to be reaching like the parents who are like unengaged in the school, right? Like those are the ones that you're like, you want to figure out what's going on there and kind of like see if there's like a way to step in. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, like, before we're talking about like shining a flashlight on data, but it's like you're shining like a flashlight that's like, I don't even know, the metaphor is going to lose me, but it's like, I don't know if it's like a flashlight that has like some paper over part of it, so you're only seeing part of the light, or if it's like shining like a flashlight through like a mirror where you get like those distortions, right? But it's like if the data is not good, then like the picture that you're trying to make decisions off isn't always what you want. And so I see Mary here is in the chat responding to my question. So Mary says 2 weeks ago, there was a report released by the Toronto Police on their profiling the community. It was interesting they had actually released it, but it did not reveal anything new to the community. So that's an interesting point, Mary. I think tell me if I'm like kind of like reading into this the right way, but you would be suggesting then that like one of the challenges of data is that the data being collected isn't like telling people what they need to know, or it's just kind of like measuring stuff that like people already know about. Would you say that's kind of like an accurate, I don't want to like put any words in your mouth, but does that kind of like align with what you were thinking?
I think another challenge with data or collecting data is how you collect the data, mainly because in the past, it used to be standard to do phone surveys, and a lot of the public opinion resources out there, like Roper and the others, don't do phone surveys anymore because they can't get a sufficient sampling. And because another place I'm looking, part of my job is to look for data, which is a little bit different than having to help create it or collect it. But I was looking at a survey by AARP in partnership with National Geographic, which I thought was an odd partnership. But they were looking at the second half of life, but they had a huge sampling that started with the years. They're talking about the second half of life, but they're looking from 18 years old onward. So this was, I know, I have to shake my head too. This was huge. And then the other part of it that made it interesting for me was that they had different methods of going through collecting it. So I think they initially started out with a mail survey, but they worked through and did mail, did online, did interviews. They actually included telephone, which a lot of people don't like to do anymore. And then they did personal one-on-one for, I think, the last 200 or so sampling that they had, because this was a national survey. And so I thought it was interesting that they didn't use one mode of collecting the information. They used multiple modes. And I just never thought of the survey being taken that way, like that. So that was sort of an interesting thing, but I've been told that that's going to change because people no longer answer their phones. So they have to find other ways to meet and collect data.
Yeah, no, it's like when you get a phone call that you don't know, you just like assume it's like a spammer, right? And that is like a big problem that like researchers have been like dealing a lot with. Because like mail-in surveys kind of have like a low response rate too, I think. Like if you mail someone a letter, like think of how much junk mail you get, and it's interesting, right? Because like one of like the moves a lot of researchers have done is like been going to like online surveys. You post something online and there's value in that, right? Because you can get a ton of responses. But you have to think of like who's online, right? Like if you're trying to do a site for the AARP, like a lot of your population you want to learn about is just like simply like not online, or they're like not using it online in a way that they're going to be like filling out like a survey. You know what I mean? And so that is really challenging. I know, like I wish that like every study, like every survey could just be like knocking on people's doors until they answer, right? And kind of like getting all the like responses from them. Uh, but yeah, no, I mean like it is always kind of like a pro con of like, or like kind of like weighing the benefits of like how much information can we get and like how much information can we afford to get, or like how much information do we have time to get, you know? So it's always tricky, but it's a really good thing to be kind of like keeping in mind when you're using someone's data, you know, like where were they kind of like making concessions and like that kind of thing. Tabarak, welcome. I noticed that you just kind of hopped on. We were just chatting through challenges associated with data. And actually, so there was a comment in the chat that I wanted to get back to. So after I get that, I'll come back to you. And so you can get kind of like an idea what we're talking about, but just thinking of like, why is it sometimes hard to use data to kind of answer a research question? Right, and so Mary, before we were talking about this report by Toronto Police about the community policing relationships. And she kind of was saying like, oh, they released this report and it didn't really tell us anything new. And what she wrote in the chat then was that what would have been more interesting is to actually do an internal survey of the forces into biased thinking, and thinking like how many times the police follow or interact with racialized people in the community, because that is before the profiling, right? Okay, yeah, kind of like thinking of other dimensions of policing that we could measure, right? Yeah, and I mean, like that's like a really hard thing, because I don't know about how it is in Canada, but in the US, like police are pretty resistant to being measured. Like this happens both kind of like within like the departments, like the leaders of the police are kind of skeptical about it, but like officers are like really nervous. I found like in some of my research, like not like I haven't researched this formally, but like in interacting with police officers during the research process, I found that they tend to be like pretty like paranoid kind of like about how their kind of like information is going to get used. So that's like a really big, like a huge challenge with measuring police, is just actually like getting enough like goodwill and trust to actually like get in there and be able to like see what we need to see. And Mary says, yes, they never follow up on the internal changes happening in the forces and their initiative to make it more diverse and introduce new graduates. The core of the system is rotten. Yeah, I can't necessarily disagree with that statement. So Tabarak, did you have any kind of thoughts about kind of like challenges associated with data? And so just like, I guess like for an idea, a couple things that we've talked about before, like before you got here, is that sometimes you like get a data set on a topic you're interested in, but it seems like the data isn't really valid. Like for some reason you think like maybe like not enough people have answered it. We also talked about like sometimes like surveys can have like bad collection methods, right? Like there's like some flaw that you can like understand, like, oh, maybe this data isn't kind of like measuring stuff right. And then there's this issue where data is not being collected on the right thing, right? Like there's a problem and data just isn't being kind of like collected in the right area. So I guess like in your mind, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so so before I start, I can give you a brief background on what I do. I work as an equity analyst with a family office fund. So we look at a lot of economic and financial data. So one of the problems, or what do I call it, like one of the challenges that I faced, in trusting some data sets was, I can give an example of University of Michigan. They gave out inflation expectations number. That is a survey-based number, and they make phone calls to around 400 to 500 participants, and based on that, and that number is so important, and that even your Federal Reserve, they look at inflation expectations number by University of Michigan to for their rate hikes and for their macro decision making. So I was kind of surprised and amused that, how can, 400 to 500 participants in a survey, how can maybe there might be a framework where, maybe it's an accurate representation of 330 million people. But yeah, I was kind of, taken aback, although I look at lots and lots of, data sets, but this is something that, and something very recent that I came across. So, I think I should share it. Yeah.
It's always like one of the weird things, right? Because like there are right, there's like some experts in survey methodology who like someone probably has like a number somewhere that's like, oh, like if we have like 400 people from like each of these like tiny little populations, right, we're like getting representative. It's like really hard to kind of like figure out like, is that right or not, right? Like it's a real black box, right? Like unless you're one of those experts who like understands like not only like statistics, but like survey statistics and like population demographics like very, very well, it's like extremely hard to kind of like assess whether that is like a valid number, right? And like that's like one of the things where you kind of like wonder like, well, if the US government is using it, like maybe it's like fine, you know what I mean? Just like deference to experts. But yeah, it like doesn't feel good when you can't like feel good about the data, right? Like making important decisions, in your case, it's like very, very important decisions for like the whole country, right? And it's like the answer is like 400 or 500 people. To Gigi's point earlier, right? Maybe those people don't even care about the survey and they're just putting in like random numbers on the phone, right? You know what I mean? Like it would really impact kind of like the way our country makes decisions if that data was bad, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just really important to keep track of this. Okay. Did anyone have any more kind of like thoughts about data challenges, or are we ready to start looking at some maps of data?
I think you should go ahead.
All right, we'll get into the data here. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Do you all see a like my web browser here? Yep, cool. So what we are looking at here is BARI's Boston Data Portal. Sorry, I need to move a book off my desk that's blocking my screen a little bit. So this is the Boston Data Portal. This is the website where we put all of our data up, and I believe that David posted that in the chat. So I think if you scroll up, you can see it. And so at BARI, we have a lot of data, and it's really important to us that like everyone can kind of like engage with our data. So what we've tried to do is create different ways of engaging with the data. And I think you'll see what I mean in a little bit. But we kind of have like two main forms that we release the data in. One is the Boston area research map. And this is really where we're going to be like hanging out today. Like probably this is like all we'll look at unless like anyone has specific questions. And so this is where we have all of our data as maps, right? At BARI, we're really interested in like neighborhoods and kind of like places. So pretty much every type of data we deal with has some kind of like geographic indicator, like GPS coordinate that we can stick on a map, right? So as you'll see in a minute, we have all of our data kind of in research map form. And like this is really good, right, for like looking at kind of like basic statistics of something, or just kind of like wanting to see like a map across the city. However, sometimes you really want to do your own number crunching, right? Like you really want to like download the Excel file that has like crime rates for every neighborhood. You want to do your own statistics on it. That we have this Boston data library. And if anyone wants after the training, I can kind of like show you around a little bit. But this is basically just like a data repository where you can download like the raw data file. So it's like exactly what we're kind of like doing our statistics with exists in that data library. So I just wanted to like plug that before chat. But for learning about crime and public safety across Boston, I think the Boston area research map is going to do us some good. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click over to that. And so this is a page that's built in Arc Online. I don't know if anyone has kind of like worked with mapping data before, but one of like the most kind of like common programs for this is called ArcGIS. and they have a platform as a web version. So this is like, it's pretty cool, right? Because it's like our publicly shared maps is actually like a expert level map platform, right? Like until like, I mean, things are changing with technology, but until like 10 years ago, like this is like the premier software for making maps, right? And we kind of have it hosted online in a browser, which is pretty cool. And so to kind of like guide people through what we offer, we kind of have like these 4 major categories of data that BARI makes available. So we have like housing and land value, that's just kind of like economic stuff, or like residential economic stuff, I should say. Commerce institutions, so that's kind of like the commercial activity. People and environments, it's kind of stuff about like who people are, right? Like between neighborhood demographics. And I'll show you a little bit of this today. And then we have crime and disorder. And because today is a public safety training, I imagine this is one of the places that we'll kind of be hanging out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a left click on this picture. And what it does is it brings us to a map. And so I'll give you all a moment. If you want to click over to this map on your own screen, you can pull it up. And so as you kind of get that up, if you want, I can tell you a little bit about what we're looking at here. So we have a map. I'm sure that probably came across. But what we have is a map composed of layers. And all that means is that you can have one map stacked on top of another, right? And so this map that we're looking at right now actually has 2 layers on top of it. In the way that we manipulate layers in this program is using these labels and these eyes on the left side of the screen. So each one of these kind of bars here, like social disorder, private conflict, each one of those labels represents a layer that we can like throw up on the map or we can turn it off. And so what I'm going to do is click on these eyeballs. If you see like for social disorder, the eyeball has like a line through it. That means the eyeball is closed. We're not looking at that layer right now. So just to kind of like start with like a blank slate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the eyeball for places of interest. Excuse me. And then I'm going to turn off the eyeball for gun crime. And if you've done that, you should just see like a Google Maps looking image of kind of like the Boston area. And feel free to let me know if you're having trouble like making your screen look like this. But what we're looking at is called a base map. And this is just like a map provided by ARC to provide some like geographic context, right? Like if we didn't have this, it would be hard to know like where in the world we were looking at. And so, you know, we have that for geographic context. And so you can zoom in and out on this map. I think it started out like somewhere like here. There's a couple ways you can zoom in. There's a plus and minus button on your upper left side of the screen. If you click the plus, it'll zoom you in. And if you take a minus, it zooms you out. And you can also use like the mouse wheel on your screen. So you might see me like zooming in without clicking those buttons. And the other kind of like main thing that you need to do to really get a good look at these maps is you need to move around, right? Because right now Boston is kind of like in the upper right corner of my screen. What you can do is if you click and hold your mouse, that's kind of like you're like grabbing onto it, and then you can pull your mouse and it will move the screen around, right? And so when you zoom, it zooms in on the center of your screen. So like say I'm like all zoomed out here. To get back to Boston, I need to drag my screen. So I have Boston roughly in the center. And then if I hit the plus button, it will zoom in on Boston, right? And just kind of need to navigate over it. So, right, it's like cool. seeing a base map, but we all are really here to learn about crime and public safety, right? So let's get going on that. As you can see from kind of like the top label here, what we are looking at is 911 dispatch data. And as you'll see, we provide a couple of different pieces of data for understanding crime. And as like I really want to talk about, these each kind of have their own pros and cons. And so this first one is 911 dispatch data. So what that means is that someone has a problem, right? Or maybe they don't have a problem. That's kind of one of the issues with this, is something's going on and someone feels the need to call it to police, right? They call 911. The dispatcher picks up, you know, they ask like, what's your problem? Maybe the person says like, oh, like I saw someone outside with a gun at, you know, like Maverick Square, East Boston. I'm just like calling that out because that's like near where I live. So what happens is the dispatcher, I mean, you know, through some process, right, will like tell the police department, oh, you need to send a cruiser to Maverick Square because someone there has a gun. When that happens, there's a database that Boston Police is keeping, and they add a row to that data set, and it says, like, at this address on this day, we had to dispatch someone out for a gun crime. And so what we do across the year, like at the end of every year, they send us all of our data. And what we do is we just like count each one of those types of dispatches that happens in each neighborhood. And then we turn it, well, first we divide it by the number of people who live in the neighborhood to make like a rate per capita, just like because some neighborhoods have more than others type of thing. But then we can kind of like throw those frequencies up on a map. And so since I used the example of someone with a gun, we can look at gun crime. And so what we are looking at here is a map where that represents in each neighborhood, like how frequently the police were called for something involving a gun. And one question you might have here is like, oh, these colors look very pretty, but I don't actually understand what they mean. If you go into the upper right corner here, there's like this like bullet list looking thing that will give you a legend. And so this just gives you the scale. I think if you read in here, it kind of tells you this specifically. But what this is it's like a rate per 1,000 residents. And so what that means is that in the simple kind of way of understanding that would be that in the areas that have like this kind of yellowy or like white color, those were the areas in Boston that had the least 911 dispatches for gun crimes. Whereas the darker blue you get, that is kind of like a neighborhood that had more, like a higher proportion of gun crime dispatches. And I guess I'm curious, right? Like this is just like kind of like the first map we've seen. But do any patterns come to mind, either in like just like on this map, you see something that's interesting, or it could be kind of like in relation to what you know about the city of Boston? And so one place that we might start is thinking about like if we think like each of these neighborhoods, right, is like its own kind of social unit, right? Like that's like a people in there know each other, right? And like that's kind of like where people are hanging out and stuff. Do we think that I'm trying to think how to ask this. Do we think that neighborhoods that have a lot of gun crime tend to be spread out from one another? Or do we think that neighborhoods high in gun crime tend to be like kind of like clustered and like next to each other, just like based on what we see here?
Based on this map, it looks like they're clustered. Because it seems like it's right all in the middle, but when you look like to the, if you go like north, you get a lot of yellow over there, and even to the west, you get like yellow and the lighter green. You might have like a spot or darker, but it just looks like it's all clustered in there right next door to one another to me.
Yeah, so if I'm picking up on your observation correctly, you're basically saying like right here, like this area, kind of like Grove Hall, like maybe getting to Dorchester, it seems like there's like a lot of these neighborhoods that all kind of have like the dark blue. But then as we kind of like go out from the center, we start to see more of the white. Is that kind of like accurate what you were saying there? Okay. Did anyone like want to have any other observations? Does anyone disagree with that? What do we think?
Could you do me a quick favor and zoom in a little bit, please?
Absolutely. Is there anything you want me to zoom into specifically?
Actually, I wanted to see, because obviously I know Boston very well. I live here, but I wasn't seeing Mattapan initially, so I want to know what the demographics look like there.
Right. Yeah. So Mattapan is kind of like,
Oh, I
this-
see it.
I think it's a little weird because like I think Mattapan is one of those neighborhoods that like kind of leaks into like another city, right?
Mm.
Right,
So I think
there-
like what we think of socially as Mattapan would definitely like go into here. But and this is one of the limitations, right? Because we're only working with Boston Police Department, we like literally don't have any other cities, right? Like if we even if we wanted to like do crime data for Cambridge, we would need to like have like a whole big like relationship and like process for sharing data, right? So I just wanted to kind of like it's like why we don't have like Brookline and stuff. But yeah, so we can go down here to that.
Okay, so that sort of brings in the question of the validity of the source, because if it's not from BPD, then it's like apples and oranges if you're looking at maybe Cambridge PD as opposed to Boston PD, right? Or am I losing something here?
No, absolutely. So I mean like so like I would say in terms of like geographic representation, like there's what we have is like valid for Boston dispatches, right? Like if we want to treat Boston as what it is, like Cambridge wouldn't really be doing dispatches in Boston, right?
Right.
So like, but yeah, I mean like we can't compare if Boston is different from Cambridge. That is like truly a limitation. But I think there's big issues of validity with 911 dispatch data. And while we're on the topic, does anyone have any ideas in mind of why there might be problems with using 911 data to understand where crime happened?
Because different PDs will have different methodologies. Yeah.
Yeah, do you have any like is there any kind of like specific differences that you have in mind?
Maybe they have they follow different rules and different categorizations of certain kind of gun crimes.
Yeah, no,
So-
that would definitely make it hard to like compare a Boston data to a Cambridge data. But I wonder if there's any reasons why we might question if 911 dispatches are actually like reflecting like the real amount of crime that happened in the police. Like, do we buy it? Like, just like on face value, do we think that like Boston PD's numbers on crime are accurate?
Well, it's interesting to note, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
It's
go on.
It's interesting to note whether or not where the BPD is getting their data from. Because for instance, like, are they just getting them from calls? Is it that they happen to be driving up onto them or into a situation? Is someone using like a call box? I mean, are they getting referrals from like EMTs or state police? It's just, where's their actual data coming from?
Yeah, and so my understanding is like this is all of it, right? Like if like the police had to dispatch, like if the police came upon something like a robbery or something, that would go in as like a dispatch, even if they were there. But a lot of it, I do think is like 911 calls and like call box and stuff, right? Like someone, like a resident sees something and they call 911 and then 911 shows up, right? And like whatever 911 showed up for is what ends up in the data. Do we see any kind of like areas where like that could like not tell us what's really going on?
Well, the MBTA has its own police department and reporting system, and when they do response to to presence of guns, they act on it, and they don't bring in BPD. I don't think. I've been on a T car with a gun, so I sort of remember that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just taking a some notes here. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And like MBTA might report to BPD, but you know who I don't think does is the university police departments. Because I think that I think like every university kind of wants to like minimize like how much crime there is. Like especially I think like with urban colleges, right? There's like a fear like, oh, like if parents think that like there's like crime going on here, then like they're not going to want to pay like, you know, $80,000 a year to like send my kids to somewhere where they're unsafe. You know what I mean? And there's actually like federal rules that like university polices have to report their crime. So yeah, I mean, I don't really trust those departments necessarily. Gigi.
One thing I noticed that we're saying 911 calls, but I remember I had an incident where I was sideswiped, not a gun call. It was just a traffic call, and I had a cell phone. I called 911, but 911 from a cell phone isn't connected to BPD. It sent me to the state police.
Interesting.
So I was like, I'm trying to get BPD. They're like, oh no, you have to call this number. They're like, when you call from your cell phone, it takes you to state police, which I thought was weird. I was literally on Warren Street in the middle of, you know, Roxbury, right by the command post. So I was like, I was hit right before there, the SWAT post. So I was thinking someone could come outside, but it went to state police instead of BPD.
Oh.
That's odd. You would hope that like state police would like direct you. You know what I mean? Because I mean that would be good for people getting help, but it would also be good for the data, right? Because then your 911 call would still end up in the data, right? One question I want to raise here, and you may notice I have an opinion on this. I'm a little biased. Do we think that everyone is just as likely to call 911 when a problem happens? See you shaking your head, Gigi. Why no?
No, I don't. I think some people prefer not to get involved, or they just look the other way. I think it depends on the severity or their severity of the crime. And, you know, I don't want to be a witness, or, you know, there's just so many factors involved with that. And then what's interesting, what about calls that get routed through a hotline? Does that count in the data for BPD? If it's like a gun buyback thing and they have a specific hotline or something like that, does that go into the regular data?
No, so I don't think that would be like a gun crime, because like what we really want to measure, right, is like someone is like out with a gun doing something they shouldn't be, you know. So I think like the gun buyback program, like unless like someone was doing something with a gun they shouldn't be at that event, it probably wouldn't be. Like you would need another data set. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Like BPD probably has a data set of like, here's every gun buyback we've done. You know what I mean? Like here's the date, here's the location, like here's, I mean, I don't know, they like their numbers, right? They probably have like, here's the exact models that we like got on this day, type of thing. Yeah, and I wonder, do we think that like trust in police could be something that's kind of like shaping how likely people are to call 911? Like I kind of wonder like if it's a neighborhood where there's like a history of kind of like negative experiences with police, right? Like police abuse and all that stuff. Like, do we think that that would like impact kind of like how likely someone is to kind of call 911 when a problem happens? Another way of thinking about this is, do we think that sometimes people call 911 when there isn't a crime happening? Is that something that happens?
I'm sorry, when there's what?
Sorry, what was that?
I'm sorry, you were saying, can you repeat what the last sentence?
Oh yeah, sure. I was
People
just asking,
call-
are there times when people call 911, but there's like not actually a crime happening?
Yeah, I think that's very possible, you know.
What type of situation might that happen?
Maybe they're alone and scared, you know.
Yeah, someone just nervous. Yeah, one of my colleagues, I don't think she'll mind me sharing this too much. Like she's from Iran, and when she first came to the US, like to the like Boston. Like she's just kind of like nervous about stuff. And like one time she like called 911 because there was like someone like had like parked their car outside and like left the door open. And she just like thought like just like not being from this country and like being in a country that had like different kinds of like safety challenges, like she thought that was like something that like 911 needed to be called over, right? And like that was not a robbery, that was like someone like bringing groceries in their house, right? But like people have different kind of like perceptions of like what makes them feel safe and stuff, right? So that can kind of like impact like, you know, who is calling 911 and why.
Yeah, because Boston is, a student city, and I think something very similar happened to me. When I was traveling, I went to Romania in 2016. I was, 18, 19 years back then. So on the first day, as soon as I reached my, student hostels, I was I had kept my money, say, hidden. I hid my money, in a safe in my bag, and I completely forgot about it. And I thought somebody has taken it out. So just because of the nervousness of traveling to a foreign country on my first day, and and the thought of having no money at all, and losing it all on the first day, I immediately reached out to the security team and asked them to take me to police and everything. Although it was a funny story because I found my money in like 10 minutes, but still this does happen, and I can relate to your colleague.
Yeah. Well, sometimes people call 911 for a medical emergency also. And it might be, a false alarm. I think I'm having a heart attack or whatever, but it's something else.
Yeah, no, I mean like measuring health is hard, right? Because like some people will have a medical emergency and,
Right.
and we'll call 911 for it, right? Like there's going to be like a lot of factors that kind of like shape whether or not someone is even like calling an ambulance at all when they have a health emergency. And it depends a lot on where you live and stuff. Right. So yeah, I mean like, right. So like this is like 911 data, right? That like a lot of people would say like this comes from like the city of Boston. This is like official information, right? Like this is the truth. Like this is how much crime happens across neighborhoods, right? But like in kind of having this conversation, we've kind of thought about like, well, sometimes people call 911 too much, right? And like sometimes people don't call 911 enough, right? Something has happened, and for some reason, people don't feel comfortable or safe calling 911. And so, if we think of these kind of issues together, do we think that there might be like certain types of neighborhoods where the official crime data like isn't very accurate? And Gigi, I see you shaking your head a little bit. Are you thinking of like any specific type of neighborhood?
No, not really, but I think like if you look at the lighted areas, how often are they really calling? What are actually the racial makeup of those areas? I think that has a lot to do with it because I know specifically the darker areas are primarily Black and brown people.
Right.
That is what I've been kind of trying to gear us up for a little bit, right? So for those of you who are not from Boston, as Gigi and you were looking at last week, right? Like these kinds of areas here are predominantly Black areas, right? And that has a lot of implications for the processes that we were talking about, right? Like those are the neighborhoods that have like historically seen police abuse, right? Like those are also the neighborhoods where like the residents are at risk of being discriminated upon, right? Like if you have like if like there's as a criminologist I can tell you there's like a lot of research that like white people are like more likely to call 911, right? Like on a non-white person doing something, right? So like there's like all of these like signals going on with like problems with the data that like these Black neighborhoods, right? Like we don't know if that data is accurate, right? Because like the specific problems that they've like faced historically are like getting fed into this data that we're trying to use to understand crime, right? It's like all these deep kind of like social issues impact how people are using the phone to report crime, which means that, right, like our data has a little bit of issues. And so if I were to kind of like bring this problem to you all and say like, okay, like 911 crime data has like a lot of problems, like as a criminologist, I don't really trust it. What are some other ways that we can maybe think about like how much crime goes on in a neighborhood, like how safe do people feel? What's like an alternative to the official crime data we can think about?
You said an alternative to the statistics like that we see, that data?
So alternatives to official data. So if you wanted to go learn about like how safe do people feel in your neighborhood that you serve, but you're saying like the crime data is bad because people in my neighborhood don't feel like comfortable calling police because like some of these 911 calls are like, you know, these people getting like discriminated against. Like how else might we think of learning like how safe people here feel?
You could probably do like a door-to-door ask or go to like a community center or something like that, or involve community or association as opposed to the police.
And that is the answer I was looking for, because that is exactly what happened. And so I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but at the top here, we have these red buttons, and these allow us to switch between data sets. And so if I click BNS survey here, this brings us over to the Boston neighborhood survey. I'm going to turn this off for a moment. And so this was done between 2006 and 2010, every couple of years. And this was done by some public health researchers at Harvard. And they really wanted to understand communities, but they also were saying, hey, this 911 data that the city is putting out might not be accurate, right? Like there might be problems. It might not really reflect how people feel. So what they did is they literally like went into every neighborhood, and they didn't have the money to go knock on doors, but they did do a bunch of phone calls, and they were able to do enough phone calls. I think they had like between 2,000 or 3,000 Bostonians were able to answer the survey. But and this is where like the black box kind of like comes into play, because they used a method where they like asked a good amount of people in every single Boston neighborhood. Even though it's only like 3,000 people, there's like a good amount of people from each neighborhood that we can kind of think about. So instead of like looking at crime data to think of like how safe people feel, they literally like ask them questions, right? Like on a scale of 1 to 5, how safe do you feel walking around your neighborhood at night? And to kind of like see how people answer those questions, we can click on this fear eyeball here. And what this brings us to is a map of fear. And so bringing up the legend. This is based off what's called a Likert scale. So like I was saying before, they literally ask people to rate like from 1 to 5, how unsafe do you feel? And then they average some questions together. So in general, people in Boston report feeling pretty safe, right? Like the most unsafe they could have felt was a 5, right? And like in the most unsafe neighborhood, the average person reported like 1.5, basically, right? So in general, like people in Boston actually feel pretty safe. But if we look at this map, right, asking people here how safe they feel, I don't know, like what do we think about these patterns here? Does this look kind of like similar to what we saw from the crime data? Does it look like something different? What do we think?
It does look similar to the crime data, but that just shows you where numbers are misleading. Because you think because it's the same color scheme and it's darker, that, you know, it's a high percentage, but when you just showed it's like, what, 1 point something, that people aren't really frightened. That's just the top of the frightful scale, I guess you could call it, which is inadequate.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? There's like different ways of thinking about it, right? Because if you want to think of like Boston as a whole, right? Like, do people in Boston feel safe, right? Like, these numbers would probably lie, right? But if you're like a nonprofit and you're like, I have like $1 million that I want to invest to make people feel safe in Boston, there the relative becomes a little bit useful, right? Because you do, in that case, like, you don't want to be putting it like downtown, like where everyone feels safe, right? Like, you still want to use the information to try to make kind of like an educated decision, right? You want to try to shine the light bulb on it a little bit, but we do know that, you know, there's like a little bit of problems with the light bulb, right? I mean, some of these things are weird, right? Like a lot of that's Franklin Park, right? Like, no one is like living in there. So, you know, it's like, what does it mean that someone lives in the park? These are kind of like the weird like data, and like some people may kind of feel like they live in that park, so I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Does anyone kind of have any other like observations in response to this pattern? It is interesting, kind of, that I think if we were to look at like the general patterns between these two maps, we would probably say they're like kind of similar, right? Like, you have kind of like this Grove Hall and Dorchester areas are kind of like more in the blue, and it's kind of like the outside of it is less blue. But I would argue that even if these data show kind of similar stories, there is a lot of value in showing the story that comes from the community, right? Like, it is giving, I think, power to the people who live there to say, like, we are going to take your perceptions and make decisions off it, rather than kind of like what Boston Police Department thinks, right? With all their biases and racism, right? Like, going to the people themselves and getting their story, right? So like, even if it agrees with like what the Boston Police Department is saying, we can like feel like a little bit better about the accuracy, right? There's still biases in the survey. We were talking about this before, right? Like, not everyone picks up the phone, and specifically, right, like the people who feel most unsafe might be the people who are like unlikely to pick up the phone, right? They're saying like, I don't know why I'm getting called right now. Like, I feel unsafe in my daily life. I don't want to pick up that phone and put myself at risk, right? Like, the stuff all kind of comes together. And so I want to show one last series of maps. We don't need to do it for too long, but I think it shows some pretty like unique ways that kind of like data can teach us about cities. And so I'm going to go back out to, was there a question?
Riley, I have a question.
Sure.
When you don't want to depend strictly on official, like a single source of information, like, I know that the city of Boston did a report called Reimagine Boston 2030, and they surveyed like, what, 15,000 people in the city over a 2 or 3 year period, and it was on a whole variety of topics. How would you smush that type of information, you know, like on safety or police involvement, with the information that you have from the 911 calls, so you could get maybe possibly a more, I guess, diverse perspective, or possibly one that would be less biased?
Yeah, and so there's no perfect data, right? Like, at the end of the day, like, every data has its problems, right? And like, what we do at BARI is combining a lot of data that all have their unique problems, right? And so like, yes, you have to kind of like from start point say like, okay, nothing's gonna be perfect. There's always gonna be like some measurement error or something. But I kind of think of it as like it's like a two-step process that's happening simultaneously, right? Like, you want to say, where do my two data sets like agree with what story they're telling, right? Like if we're looking at these two maps that we were just looking at, they both kind of tell this like big broad story that kind of like Dorchester, Roxbury areas like have some kind of like problem with safety going on there, right? That is something that like both of our data sets kind of agree on, and they're kind of like from opposite sources, right? So if we kind of consider like, okay, these are two people who we think like might disagree, but there's like a kind of like big picture thing that they agree on a lot, that we feel a little bit comfortable about. You know what I mean? We can say like, okay, like this seems like people are agreeing about this. But then you also need to think about like, where do my data sets disagree, right? And so I want to go back to 911 dispatches for a second here. I'm trying to see. I mean, so like the example that kind of got flagged already by me was like this Franklin Park thing, right? If we're looking at 911 dispatches, Franklin Park is like down here, and there's like some neighborhoods next to it. I don't know why it's not lighting up, right? On the 911 data, we see that there's like apparently no gun crime there, right? If we go to the BNS survey, all of a sudden that area kind of has guns, right? So you like wonder who's right. And I can tell you from giving a presentation about this map to some high schoolers who like go to school around here, when you bring up Franklin Park, the kids are like joking about gun violence, right? So I mean, there's like a third perspective here of like, you know, the kids who are not surveyed but or who are living by that neighborhood, and they are, without even being asked, telling me that like gun violence is a problem here, right? So I mean, that's kind of like, there's like always more voices that you can hear from. That's kind of like why we have to say like data is not perfect, right? Because there's always like some other perspective. But by considering like whose perspectives are being represented and who is like being ignored, that's kind of like how we make decisions about like what data we can trust, right? Is there someone who like really knows a lot about this? Like those kids who live there, they know very well, right? Like that's probably like the best eyes on the street as far as what's going on, because they're the ones who are like out and about there. You know what I mean? But they're not representing the data, right? I don't know if that actually like answered your question, or if that was just kind of like creating more questions due to kind of like the challenge of doing this. But that's how I tend to think about this, is like seeing like where do data sets agree and where do they disagree. And so we're kind of getting a little bit close to time on here. I know that at the end here, David is gonna lead a bit of a discussion, kind of like thinking like, okay, given all of this, like how do we move forward? But before I kind of like pull this off the screen, did anyone have any questions about the maps I've shown, Gigi?
I'm just wondering, what is social disorder?
Good question. So social disorder is a concept that comes from broken windows theory. I'm not sure if anyone in this room has heard of broken windows theory, but it was a theory of crime that became very popular in the 1990s. Sorry, there's a truck going by. But broken windows theory was very popular in the 1990s. It was like Rudy Giuliani was one of the people pushing it in New York. And they had this idea that basically like if a neighborhood has trash, then people in the area are going to stop caring as much about it, and criminals are going to say like, oh, people don't care about the neighborhood, I'm going to like move in and start doing crime, right? So there was this theory that social disorder could predict more violent crime in the future. And so the way that they measure social disorder for this, they were asking people questions like, on a scale of 1 to 5, like how much you see broken windows out in the street. I think there's questions like, how often do you see people intoxicated on drugs in public? One of the questions is like, how often do you see children without any shoes, right? Just kind of trying to get at like that like social stuff that's going on. And kind of like, so like broken windows theory like isn't really very well supported. Like actually like Dan O'Brien, who like runs BARI, kind of has like the best research study on that. Like he went through all of like every single analysis on broken windows theory, and he basically found that like the papers that are like supporting broken windows theory have like bad research methods. And we can see that a little bit here, right? Because like according to to this theory, these areas with like really high social disorder should be the exact same places that have like that gun crime we were looking at before, right? But like if we look at the data, and we actually have this for 911 too, right? Like with the 911 data, it's even worse. And like, it totally makes sense, right? Like downtown, you have like a lot of people kind of like asking for money, right? Like you have people kind of like selling drugs out in public, right? Like these kinds of like, those are the kinds of social disorder stuff, right? And you have a lot more of that actually downtown than you do like out in residential neighborhoods. Right, so this is like a cool way kind of where like data can help us kind of like untangle some of our assumptions, right? You know, it's like this like, kind of like minor disorder is not like what makes a neighborhood kind of like unsafe. Does anyone have any other questions about the maps that are shown? All right. Well, before I pass it over to David, I just want to like put out a reminder. As the data consultant, it is literally like my job, paid for by grant, to help people not only use this platform, but also to kind of like answer research questions, right? So if there's like, if like this map like got you thinking about new questions that we didn't get to today, like you can shoot out an email. There's a couple emails online. I'll post that in the chat before we go. But yeah, I mean, just like feel free to reach out. Like we really want to help people through these research projects. Like for me, that's like kind of one of the most like fulfilling parts of the job, I think, is like being able to help people answer their research questions, you know, kind of like empower people to make the change they want to see. I don't know, I think it's a real privilege for me to be in the position to help people do that. So if you ever kind of like have stuff that I can help you with, I'd really like to hear from you. Sorry, before we go, I did see that, or not before we go, before I pass it over to David, I saw that Mary had a question. And so Mary was asking, are there community characteristics that are overlaid on top of the safety data? And so Mary, this is the type of thing that if you want to do a consultation, it's all free. You and I can just meet one-on-one and talk about it. But just to like whet your appetite, I can show you that if you go to this main page here, if you go to people and environments, under the census here, we have a lot of different maps of demographics. So like, I think one that's kind of like logical to look at with this stuff would be like percent Black, which looks a little bit weird because Boston is just like very segregated, but that is kind of like how the city goes. There's a lot of other stuff here. One thing I was hoping to show you all today, but we just ran out of time. It's cool. You can look at it on your own and let me know if you have questions. Is from that same survey that we were looking at about the crime. There was all these questions about like neighborhood social dynamics, right? So like for this one we're looking at, they asked people like on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you trust your neighbors, right? Or for like intergenerational closure, it's like how much do adults and youth in this neighborhood kind of get along. And it turns out that like the research shows that this stuff is like really important for crime, right? Like this like social cohesion, do people trust each other, like explains why like low income neighborhoods have more crime. Like that's kind of like where the research stands on it, right? So like this is like a really kind of like, this is like kind of where I was hoping to end today. We had like so much good conversation that we didn't get here. But I would encourage you to kind of like look at these maps. You can like email me if you have questions about this stuff. Yeah, just let me be a resource. And Mary, this people and environments page will have a lot of stuff I think you'll be interested in. And it's really cool. You can just kind of like, you know, with tabs, you pull 2 tabs, one on each side of your screen. You pull up the crime on the left side of your screen. You pull up like the race map or like the social cohesion map on the right, and you can tell some really cool stories this way. So definitely let me know if you ever want to kind of talk about that more. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Dave.
Awesome. Great job, Riley. We're just going to go through just a few minutes, just to go through what folks learned, what kind of challenges they had, how are you guys going to use this in your work going forward. and if this is useful to what you needed today. Gigi, can we start with you?
I think any information is useful information. I'm unsure how I'm going to use it at this point. I know for my job, I have to do a opportunity and an opportunity and assessment, an asset and opportunity assessment. Let me say that correctly. And it had a lot of questions like, oh, what's the data for this? What's the data for that? But what I found is I couldn't track some of it. I couldn't get the information because my school didn't track that data. So I didn't have access to it, but maybe some stuff I didn't have, I might be able to find on this, or just give it a generalization that I didn't have before. So I'll probably use it towards my AOA.
Christine?
Well, I've learned a lot about the nuances in the survey information, and I, like Mary, I get a lot of questions. I mean, like Gigi, I get a lot of questions about, is there data on this? And again, sometimes it's a case that people are asking for data because they assume everything is available in data, but unless you collect it, it won't be there. And so, but there's some other options or looks I could do. I mean, this is not basically for my research. It's usually for students or researchers who, you know, come to the library and ask this question, and they need to A, find data, B, figure out how to wrangle it, and C, analyze it. So they have to organize, not only look for it, but they have to organize it and then analyze it. And so that's kind of been a challenge for everybody involved. We have more questions than we have expertise or experience available to handle this.
Yeah, and that's why you know, the BARI is here, and that's why the BARI and the consultants are here to help and answer some of these questions, because we understand that gathering data is not always the easiest thing. So we are hoping that, you know, as every year, every couple months, as there's new available data that's put on the portal, that this is helpful in folks' efforts. Mary, any takeaways, anything that you learned, how can this help you going forward?
This has been very great. Thank you so much. Just seeing how it's reflected in a map, seeing what the color choices convey, the type of background explanation about what went into the process, it's been very enlightening. So it's kind of it's helping me to understand the importance of visual representation of data, but it's also helping me to understand, for instance, like I've done mapping in school, but this data and this mapping is not actually accessible to the community. It's only accessible, for instance, through news. Like the news uses, I guess, this type of research to kind of like do news stories or segments, but there's not really like a community push to do some of this research or mapping itself. There's like very few organizations in the city that are really doing this, but mostly like they're focused on education. Whereas my interest is more in the link of the two, right? Because here, as somebody who's experienced this, there is an interconnection between people who are not going to school, who are doing these types of crimes that the city is very concerned about. So I'm interested in the linking. And then I'm interested in maybe having something that the community can understand, because right now it's very exclusive and it's only being presented through academics like the universities or through the news. But there are community groups and people like myself and younger people, older people, I'm not going to be biased, there are people who are interested in this. I think that if there is a way to do this, to make it more open, because they call it an open data hub, but to make it more open, it would be very helpful to the city, to the citizens, right? Yeah, so this has been very, very positive. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for joining us, and I hope as you go about serving your communities and really making an impact, and through your research, holding folks in public policy accountable, but about the changes that you want to see. Hopefully, this can strengthen your argument, strengthen the initiatives that you wish to see come to fruition. If we can be of any assistance, please feel free to contact us at any time. We're at bari@northeastern.edu. We'll answer any questions, and if you'd like to schedule a training with a community group or your organization, also please let us know. We can also do that. And these trainings are free, so it's open to the public. Our goal is to train the next generation of data research or urban researchers here in the city of Boston. We feel as though data and technology are a gateway to changing the city in the way that you want it, so that you can have an equitable experience here in the city. In this training, in this portals for everyone to use, and we want to do our part to help the community in that effort. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. We'll be sending out a short survey later on today about the training. Please fill that out at your earliest convenience, and we'll also post this training on our YouTube page for folks to access it on their own. Any last questions? So Gigi?
Yes. Are there other initiatives like yours around the country that focus on other cities? So I know it seems like you're specifically, Boston, but is there someone doing it for like New York, or I don't know, Springfield, Missouri, or something like that? Are there other entities like you that exist?
I don't want to overspeak and say yes. Riley, any
Yeah, I can get that a little bit. So I mean, like, there's like different versions of like what this is, right? So like, to kind of like Mary's point, right? Like, there's like a big thing of like open data portals. So like New York has an open data portal, Chicago has an open data portal. Mary taught me today that Toronto has one. I think like it's like getting pretty common. Like I think I've seen one for like Charlotte, North Carolina. Like I think like most major cities are kind of starting to understand that like, okay, like people are becoming data literate and like people want to see our data, right? There's like a lot of people that want that. So I mean, there's like a lot of like open data portal, and like Boston has an open data portal independent from ours, right? Like a lot of the data is the same. Some of it's like we have stuff they have some stuff they don't share with us. But right, so like a lot of cities have it. As far as organizations that are trying to get stuff out into the public, that I don't know. Like there's like broad kind of like urban research stuff, but I don't know about like too many organizations, excuse me, that are like combining like the research with like the open data stuff.
That part doesn't really matter. I was just more or less, but there are other open data portals out there. I think that was really my question.
Yeah, no,
But you
definitely.
answered that.
If you just like want to see like how Boston compares to other cities, then yeah, like I would say like if you just like type into Google like Lawrence, open data portal, like there's a good chance that you'll get something. And it depends on what you're looking for, right? Like this is always the type of thing that you can like email me about, but like the census releases data for the whole country, right? So if you just wanted to know like what's like the racial demographics of like New York City, then like I mean that they have an open portal for that, right? But like if they didn't, like we could show you how to like collect that information. It's like it's something that you could do.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. We finished right on time. And we look forward to really working with you guys in the future. So please feel free to email us, and we'll answer any questions and schedule additional trainings. This is our last one for the summer, so we'll see you guys back in September, hopefully, and we'll continue to engage with the community. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
All right, thanks everyone. Great seeing you. Have a good day.
Bye.